So, on the 29th of September 1939, a guy called P.W. Botha borrowed £75 from a bank. We're at the Absa Money Museum and we're looking at the relics of the past. We're going to talk to Neil Ferguson, who is the author of The Ascent of Money, about how money has evolved over millennia. Then we'll come to the Absa Money Museum, old school banking like this brass. Remember when banks weren't robbed as much as they get robbed now, when you could actually talk to the teller across? That's what we're doing next time on Taking Stock. We're going old school, talking about the history of money here at the Absa Money Museum. This is Taking Stock. I am Bruce Whitfield, and a different broadcast this evening. This was filmed at the RMB Global Markets Seminar a couple of weeks ago, when Neil Ferguson, one of the world's leading historians on money and civilization and the impact on society, was in Cape Town. And I managed to catch up with him to talk about a little bit about the history of money, the present state of money, and what the future of money might look like. I'm going back to one of the many books that he's written, of course, called The Ascent of Money. And money shaped the world. It shaped the economies of today. It shaped civilization. I mean, but you kind of put it all back to, once we stopped dealing in shells and trinkets, to the Medicis and Italy, really. I mean, I suppose that's where the real history of money starts.
Yeah, there really isn't a tremendously sophisticated banking system in ancient Rome. And you don't really get anything resembling modern banking until the 13th, 14th, 15th century, where North Italy leads. Prior to that, money basically takes the form either of tokens, you mentioned shells, those certainly were used by some civilizations, but predominantly coins. And coins go back a very long way indeed, precious metal, but not necessarily base metal too, often, very often stamped with somebody's head to signify the fact that the coin was issued by a particular prince. So banking doesn't really get started until the Middle Ages. And of course, we don't get banknotes until the 17th century in the Western world, a bit earlier in China, but really they don't become standard in China, which remains a coin-based monetary system really right into the 20th century.
I mean, but that stamping of the head on the coin, the stamping of authority, the monetary system of today is a statist monetary system. Right. States issue and present their own currency. It is still very much the authority of the state on money.
That's right, and ideas of legal tender tell you that from a very early stage, states sought to establish monopolies on money. Monopolies, for example, on the minting of coins. Debasing the coin, diluting the precious metal content, became a source of revenue for many states, including England in the 16th century. So it's possible throughout history to find non-state money, but most money over time has been associated with a state, whether it's coins, banknotes, or the kind of money that we have today, which is actually largely digital money in bank accounts, money that you can't actually see.
And that's what causes people to panic about money and the value of money. I mean, up until we got Richard Nixon was running out of money and needed to get out of the Vietnam War and decoupled money from the gold standard. And suddenly every dollar in the world was not underpinned by the equivalent value of gold in a bank. And suddenly we had fiat currency, these weird, amorphous, floating things whose values were determined on the value of the underlying country, the assets and sentiment.
Well, most people watching this show have only ever known fiat currency because, beginning in the early 1970s, the last links between money and precious metal were severed. They'd largely dissolved in the course of the 20th century, but if you go back to the early 20th century, most monetary systems were based on gold. The gold standard, which was a British invention, had become more or less global by the eve of World War I. And then, of course, the World Wars caused that system gradually to come apart at the seams. So by the 1970s, it was gone. And so fiat money is the norm today. What do we mean by fiat money? Well, fiat just means the state says it's got some value, you better believe it. And that means that when you pick up a banknote, it essentially is making a claim about its monetary value that is largely fictitious because it's just a piece of cloth, a banknote. Yeah. The interesting thing about fiat money is that for a while, early in its career, beginning in the 70s, it was a very poor store of value. Very high inflation tended to erode the real purchasing power of fiat currencies, including the mighty US dollar. That's been much less true in the last 10 years when inflation rates have gone very low indeed and have almost been negative in some countries. So we've got accustomed to fiat money as being something that doesn't rapidly lose its value. The question, of course, is what comes next?
And we're sort of dabbling in what comes next. I mean, 18 months ago, you couldn't buy a Bitcoin for $5,000 or $10,000 and $15,000 and then to $20,000. People went completely mad for something that had less tangible value than even a banknote or a coin. It was this invisible, digital, I hate to call it an asset, but that's what they called it.
But it wasn't entirely coincidental, I think, that Bitcoin was launched just around the same time as the financial crisis was getting going in 2008. And there was a period, if you think back to 2008, 2009, think back 10 years, when the international monetary system appeared to be falling apart. Banks were being propped up with massive bailouts in the Western world, and many investors thought, gee, I wish I had some gold in case this whole thing is going down. Others, I guess slightly more technologically sophisticated investors said, why don't we have a kind of digital version of gold? And I think that's how one should think about Bitcoin. It's not really a way of paying for things. You're not going to go and buy your latte with a Bitcoin, but you could conceivably hold Bitcoin in your portfolio the way you might hold gold as a hedge against some kind of monetary breakdown, as a hedge against the breakdown of fiat monetary systems.
Do you see a future of borderless digital currencies? I mean, the South African rand is a deeply vulnerable developing market, emerging market currency, massively volatile as a result. The dollar for now is the world's reserve country, could be the renminbi into the future, that'll be the euro. I mean, there is so much uncertainty of the future of politics and societies and civilizations. Is the future of currencies sort of almost back to the Wild West days of every village has its own bank and issues its own currency?
I doubt it very much. Good. I mean, I think that the experiments with cryptocurrencies that became really rather a mania in 2017-18 have revealed that probably blockchain, the underlying technology, isn't really the best way of reconfiguring a monetary system. I mean, part of the problem is that the fiat currency system is working reasonably well. It didn't fall apart in 2008, 2009. It isn't very prone to inflation anymore. And in terms of cross-border transactions, it works more smoothly and with less cost than at any time in the past. So the system isn't so catastrophically broken that you really need to reinvent money. On the other hand, I think there's a really interesting question coming up, and that is how far the US-based system, which is essentially a 1970s system. Think of, for example, SWIFT, which was how we make interbank payments across borders. I mean, SWIFT is a 1970s invention. Credit cards are basically a 1970s kind of thing. It's all quite old school. The question is there a new version of payments arising in the East, a Chinese-based system using things like Alipay and its WeChat Tencent equivalent? That's a new kind of digital money, and it's spreading very rapidly around the world.
Is it a new kind of digital money, or is it simply creating a mechanism for existing money to move and transfer more easily?
Yes and no. It is, of course, rooted in, if you look at the big payment platforms in China, in conventional money market accounts. But the way in which Chinese transactions are now processed, the way in which Chinese people can now pay for more or less everything with their phones, is novel, and it's way more efficient and much cheaper than the rather clunky ways in which Americans, and indeed most of the rest of the world, still pay for stuff.
What do you say to people who are scared of that money future, that financial future, that future where it's even less tangible than it is today?
Well, I think one has to be a bit nervous if the world's payment architecture is going to shift from being American to being Chinese. Because if you think about it, the spread of Chinese platforms really implies that financial data will be accessible via Jack Ma to Xi Jinping. The Chinese are not famous for respecting citizens' privacy in the realm of technology. So I think there is a reason to be concerned about that. But, you know, when people say to me, oh, gee, I'm really worried about the future of money because it's not going to be tangible, it's just going to be digital, I say, like, it's been like that for years, dude. You really didn't have a pile of banknotes that you were reaching into the bank to withdraw. That's just a fantasy. But I mean, I'm always struck when I talk to people about the history of money, how old-fashioned they imagine the system to be. And most people find it really hard to come to terms with the reality that the money that they think is theirs is just a series of electronic entries in a bank's ledger. That's really all money is, and that's been true for some time.
And essentially, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The evolution of money has been fairly slow and steady, and will continue probably to be fairly slow and steady.
I'm not sure if I agree with that, Bruce. I mean, I think the interesting thing about monetary history is that there are these paradigm shifts.
There are moments in history where there is a transformational moment.
Right, and if you think of the way in which money evolved in the 18th, 19th, 20th and into the 21st century, it's not actually a gradual continuum. There are these big disruptions like Richard Nixon announcing no more connection between the dollar and gold, or the big hyperinflations of the 1920s.
Are we there now?
Yeah, I think we may be. I mean, the assumption that the dollar will always be dominant, I think, is misplaced. The one thing I learned from writing the history of the ascent of money, a new edition of which is coming out very soon, updated to the present day, is that actually money is closely associated with power, and power is based on financial innovation. And when I look at China, what I see is a lot of financial innovation going on there. And as long as the Chinese are winning the financial race, the fintech race,
yes,
it doesn't really matter what happens in the trade war. The trade war is a kind of 1970s thing in itself. So watch closely as Chinese digital payment systems spread around the world, including to Africa, where the Chinese are making very rapid inroads and the American competition isn't really visible at all.
The evolution of money and the way it's going to change. It is, most certainly. Neil Ferguson is one of the world's leading thinkers, writers and most prolific authors on money and civilizations and the interplay between those. This is Taking Stock.